Welcome to the Marriage Puzzle Podcast with Julie and Thomas Hobby. We are marriage coaches who help couples with pain points about money, intimacy, and communication go from being overwhelmed to being secure in their marriage.
If this is your first time listening to us, thanks for checking out our podcast. And don't forget to subscribe and leave us a rating and a review. Let's dive into this episode. Hey everyone, welcome to the Marriage Puzzle Podcast with Thomas and Julie Hobby. You're just going to hear me on this one tonight because, as you know, if you've been listening, my wife and I recently had a baby and he is still in the hospital. And so my wife is actually out at the hospital visiting him tonight. So I'm going to be hosting, but I am privileged to have some special guests with us tonight, some dear friends to us, Aaron and Jocelyn Freeman, and they are the authors of the book, The Argument Hangover. Aaron and Jocelyn, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having us. We're so glad to connect with you.
Yeah, excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, this is super exciting for us. We've known you guys for a while. You were very welcoming to us in the marriage space when we came in, and you've helped us so much along the way. We've learned so much from you, and we got to check out this book, and I know you guys wrote it a little while ago, but we're finally getting around to connect on it because we've had some crazy life things going on with us. You guys recently had a baby, and so we're really just now getting the chance to connect on it. But tell us a little bit about the book, The Argument Hangover, and what inspired you to write it, and where did it come from? How did it come to be?
It came from us having our own argument hangovers. If you think about it, like everyone who has heard the term, we don't even really have to describe it a lot of times. People will just go, oh, yep, I get it. Have had an argument hangover. It kind of describes itself. But where it came from was all of our work with couples. We would hear this theme, after disagreements, after an argument, they would describe feeling disconnected, not talking for a day or a few days, maybe feeling even some guilt, for how they acted. And one day during a coaching session, one of us, maybe me,
it was you. I'm not gonna fight you and
get
a hangover on it. It was you. Yeah, it was great.
I said, it sounds like an argument hangover. And they were like, that's it. That's exactly what it describes. So we, kind of coined the term now. And I love that it gives people language, but it came from our experience as well with couples. And we definitely had different fighting styles, if you want to speak to that a little bit.
Well, I mean, the book is about seeing conflict differently, first of all, because conflict isn't a bad thing. And this is something we might go further in on the podcast. Conflict allows for something, but it's just the way in which we all, by default, even view conflict that it seems like a bad thing, or we avoid, so then we don't talk about it. But all you listening, if you've been impacted and you've had a conflict, just ignoring it doesn't change anything for you, right? It just kind of goes on, or it gets triggered later. And that's something else we talk about is emotional triggers. We talk about before, during, and after conflict strategies. So it really is about the communication and conflict tools and skills to actually take those moments that would be tension or things that disconnect you to create connection, understanding, or even clarity for a new season.
Yeah, and I mean, I love that you just bring up the word conflict because it sounds like such a nasty word that we just don't want to address and we don't want to talk about. But when you add the word resolution at the end of that and change it into conflict resolution, that brings this whole different meaning to conflict, that conflict is necessary to have a resolution. And to have a resolution, the two of you have to kind of get on the same page and decide that you're going to work together towards that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. I mean, and that's a big shift that we're out to create with couples, because we have a phrase in there that avoiding conflict in the short term builds resentment in the long term. And there are so many, phrases, don't rock the boat, just sweep things under the rug. So we've been culturally brought up into this idea that conflict is bad. And so then people are avoiding conflict, or on my end, I just did things that were destructive during conflict and only escalated things. So no one showed me or us how to have conflict be something that can be healthy and actually lead to a better outcome for you two. So we're out to change the conversation around it, not being something that has to cause turmoil and pain and disconnect, but actually bonding and repair and getting to better solutions together. Was there anything you want to add to that?
Well, in your own individual life, conflict is always necessary for creativity or innovation. I mean, if you think of any time in your life when you were single, you had a certain level of internal tension or conflict about being in a relationship.
Right.
And it was that tension or conflict that led you to do something different to even get into a relationship, let alone a marriage. And you always have seasons of that, a new job or becoming parents, whatever it is. Conflict is necessary to progress. And that really is a key thing. We think that once we're in a marriage, conflict is a bad thing.
Mhm.
But no, it's your next step to progress to whatever is your next season or next stage of a relationship.
That's absolutely correct. And we often cringe when we hear couples tell us like, "Oh, we never fight. Everything's great." And it's like, "Oh man, what are you building up inside if you never fight?" And yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's got to be one couple out there that is just doing everything great and doesn't fight, but that's really not the norm for most couples, right? I mean, they're just as in terms of living together, you have different habits, you have different ways that you grew up. And Jocelyn, you mentioned that kind of in your upbringing of what you were raised around in terms of
Mhm.
conflict. That just, whether you like it or not, you're bringing two styles of that from two different upbringings into your marriage, and you have to sort through that. And I love in your book, you give some great tips around, you guys call them the 5 R's. And I'd love to kind of have you guys touch on that a little bit and give the listeners a little bit of that context of how you kind of take those different upbringings and kind of mold them together in this nice little plan of these these 5 R's that you can kind of work through to resolve that conflict.
Yeah.
I'll let you start, but I'll just say, well, part of why we avoid conflict is because it feels like a chaotic, it's a reactive thing, something in which you don't have a current process
Mhm.
to follow so that you can turn that conflict into the opportunity that it can be. So that's kind of why we avoid. So having 5 R's, having these steps actually allows you to lean into conflict better, right? Just because you have a conflict doesn't mean you have to fight.
Right,
Conflict is seeing something that you have a different perspective on
right.
something and you're going to have some emotion. But with this process, you can go into it and create the opportunity rather than react and get into the traditional fight, right? So,
Well, and I'll add too, so it's the 5 R's to repair.
Okay.
And so we talk about, and this is from our research, and actually not even just our research, there's been a lot of research done in the marriage space, that it's actually a lack of repair that leads to couples being disconnected or ending their relationship. It's not conflict in and of itself, it's that
Right.
it doesn't get repaired. So
Yeah.
since it's really about repair, we created the 5 R's to give couples a process, because really it's not about just saying I'm sorry.
Mhm.
Because I can say, I'm sorry, Aaron, and you can still wonder, well, sorry about what?
Right.
And do you really understand how I feel about things and what's going to be different next time? So we created these 5 R's. The first R, and then maybe we can take turns here, but the first R is to reflect.
Hmm.
We need to reflect after an argument, and not on why the other person is wrong. You're not sitting there stewing over all the reasons that they are the bad person in the situation. You're actually reflecting on the root cause. Like, what is this really about? Was this an emotional trigger? Was this an unmet need? Was this an unexpressed expectation? Is this something actually from our past we haven't resolved? So, what's really the root cause? And then also reflecting on your part in the situation. How did you contribute?
which is really the second step.
Mhm.
But the key thing here is you're not just distracting yourself.
Right.
You're not just going to the phone, or you're not playing a video game. You're not even just going to the gym or going for a walk and then like not thinking about it.
Right.
That's more of like you're avoiding what happened. So you do need to take a particular amount of time to reflect, to actually think and contemplate on the things that Jocelyn just said,
Mhm.
which then the second step is kind of done at the same time. So we'll go into that one. It really is not just reflecting and saying what was the source and then still kind of looking at your partner as they're the ones to blame. True repair is going to start when you look for where you have responsibility.
Okay.
It's not this game of, well, did I start this, or was that my fault, or do I have any role that I played here? It really is about, what role did I play?
Right.
Now we can expand upon that to say, well, maybe you played a role in how it started. Okay, yes, but maybe you played a role in
Why it escalated.
or that your argument hangover is days and not a few minutes, right? So you look at the whole process and really look at, okay, during this whole thing, there was how it started, there was how it got escalated, there's how long it's been disconnected. Like, where in there do I have some responsibility?
Then the third R, right? So we've got reflect, take responsibility. The third R is to now reconnect. And a big thing that we advocate for with couples is not waiting too long to reconnect.
Mhm.
I mean, I know that there have been times, especially in past relationships where I didn't do any of this work, where, I mean, we could go days without talking, right? And when we talk to a lot of couples, I mean, they'll just be functioning. They're in the same kitchen, giving each other the silent treatment
Mhm.
for too long. And we miss out on life, and we miss out on connection, and it actually erodes trust and stability.
Right.
So it's reconnecting. And in this reconnect stage, here's a prompt. Those of you listening are going to want to write this down. Go to your partner and start off with this. I've been reflecting, and where I see I can take responsibility is. Your partner will be floored that you started the conversation that way. What? Not only did you reflect, but now you're saying what you're taking responsibility for. It
Right.
will really start things off in a constructive way.
Mhm.
Now, the whole goal of this reconnect stage, regardless of whether it's a 5-minute conversation or 5-hour, because every conflict is going to require a different length of time to repair. The goal is that you two are validating each other's experience and acknowledging the impact you had on each other.
Mhm.
What does impact mean? Impact means it's either something, the way you said it, how you said it, the words you used, it impacted your partner. It did it hurt them? Did they feel disrespected? Was it, I mean, just what was the impact of your action? And if you're not sure, ask them,
Right.
how did I impact you in that conflict? Because that's usually what is kind of lingering after conflicts, is this almost thought of like, oh, they said that thing in the heat of the moment. Did they mean that?
Right.
We can be left with these things we're wondering. Or, oh man, the way they talk to me, it doesn't seem like they, really respect me. And I'm left with that feeling of not being respected.
So let me pause here, because there's a number of ways to listen, ways to communicate. There are a number of factors in the actual execution of this. So I want to check in with you.
Yeah.
Where would you like to go? Because there is a lot in this step.
Yeah, I think that, talking about the impact that had, I mean, that is really something that can just happen in the heat of the moment, right? It can be misinterpreted. When you're in the heat of the moment in that fight, you can just say something, and what you say can be completely interpreted in a different way by your spouse. And coming back to that reconnection, and I may come back and say, to Julie, hey, this is what I feel like I did wrong. She may have a complete different thought of what I did wrong because she interpreted it differently than how I said it. So we all know that in the heat of the moment, these miscommunications can happen. And so I think that's a big piece to really talk about is, what happens when, because I hear you saying, don't come back to that reconnect part and say, here's what you did. You want to start with I, but how do you get to the point of where it's okay to say, okay, you also did this that hurt my feelings or hurt me in that situation, if they don't address it, because I know that we're trying to take this standpoint of, you don't want to attack them. And there's obviously a fine line there of not attacking them, but making sure that you leave this feeling heard. Otherwise, you're not going to reconcile. If you don't feel like you're heard or that you got your point across, and maybe getting your point across is the wrong phrase, but if you don't feel like you were heard, you're not going to be able to reconcile. So how do you circle back to that you if they don't address that on their own?
Good question.
Yeah, really good question. I mean, ideally, both partners are interested in repair and know the 5 R's.
Mhm.
So it's, easier to have that back and forth. And there's an understanding that both of you are going to have the opportunity to share the impact
Right.
and trust the other person is going to hear and validate you. So if they're not, however, and this can also be retroactively, I just want to say, you may realize that you're still impacted by something. So you might not have had like an argument and you're in the argument hangover, and then now you're doing the 5 R's. You might be going about and you guys feel connected, but you realize, there's something I'm not repaired about.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that will be slightly different where you need to start the conversation with them and let them know that you're not repaired.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to segment that one and really talk about still when you have a conflict and you both like know and are in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then in the reconnect, you kind of have to believe in reciprocity. And it really does work, right? If you're wanting to repair and you're wanting your partner to lean into the conversation and you're ultimately wanting them to hear you, it's not manipulation, but the very best way to have you feel understood is to first have them feel understood in their impact.
Right.
So if you start and you're saying things like, hey, where I see I have responsibility is, and I imagine that impacted you by maybe you felt disrespected, you felt isolated, shut out. And then as we've been talking, you also don't want to assume that you know what impacted them the most.
So can I add to that?
Yeah.
A great question that you can ask each other after you both share. Like if I were to go to him and see, I take responsibility for my tone. I'm sure it had you feel, disrespected and I don't want to do that. I could then say this is key. Was there anything else that impacted you? So ideally you'd ask each other. Now, if your partner isn't listening to this with you and you're going to be doing this, I would just say, hey, can I share something that impacted me in particular? Because I want to put this in the past. I want to be resolved about this, but I just feel this one more thing is impacting me. So you can kind of cue your partner.
Opening that door for the permission from them lowers the guard so that, they don't have to go back on defense.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's perfect.
And when you are going first and you say what Jocelyn just said, hey, was there anything else you were impacted by? All right. You're going to probably hear something you didn't think of.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, oh, well, it actually wasn't your tone. It was the way you just like walked out, or it was like a body language. And you're like, oh, well, I didn't even think about that.
Right.
So that's why this repair process is so powerful, because you're actually finding out what was impactful for them and not making some assumptions. So when you really get to the root, you could actually pause. And if you think about the most natural thing in humans is reciprocity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's used in sales, it's used in everything, right? Like if I give something to someone, they're like 90% or more willing to give me something back.
Right.
So when you do that, when your partner feels validated and heard, you could even just stop talking. And what's the most natural thing for them to say is,
well, I can see where I take responsibility is.
Yeah, where I think I played a role too is, and how did that impact you, right? It's the most natural thing when someone else, first of all, feels understood and validated and heard.
So when one of you can swallow your pride first and go back to that, and talk about it from the I perspective rather than the you perspective, then it obviously makes it easier for them to, again, not that you're necessarily going back to try and force their hand to do that, because they have to be ready and willing, but it definitely does make it easier. I could totally agree to that. So I think next was remind. That was the fourth R, correct?
Yeah, so those 3 steps in and of itself would be really powerful.
Those are
But there still are 2 more that are like the whipped cream and cherry on top. Okay, so there's still the 4th R, which is to remind, and it's specifically reminding each other of what your commitment is moving forward and what your agreements are. So
Okay.
these are 2 important things. So let me describe them. Your commitment moving forward is important if especially there were maybe things that were hurtful that were said, or the other person really feels impacted, or, just was kind of damaging.
Right.
Then you want to share what you're committed to moving forward. Like, hey, I know that was really not a great conflict, and I acted in ways that didn't have you feel respected. My commitment moving forward is I want to fight in healthy ways. I want to make sure I am respectful to you moving forward. So I'm kind of declaring my intention and making sure that they feel I'm going to work on something moving forward. Because that's, again, part of the thing that lingers for people is like, what's going to be different next time? Or
is
what
anything actually going to change?
Exactly. So you're sharing your commitment shows that you're thinking to the future. Then the second piece within the remind stage is what your agreements are. Now, 99.9% of you said, Freemans, what agreements? So that's another key thing. We actually go more in depth into that in the book as well. But we're huge on having agreements in a relationship in many places, like agreements for how finances are handled or agreements for how you handle parenting. But in this context, specifically agreements for times of conflict. So we're big on like literally have it written down. What are your agreements for how you want to fight fair? Think about a boxing match. The only reason it works is because there are rules. You can't hit below the belt. You can't hit after the bell. And same
you can't bring
thing.
in a chair from the stands and hit the other person, right? I mean, it creates more damage. The only like you said, the only reason boxing can actually be a sport. What is a sport? A sport is there's an outcome, there's goals, but there are rules, there's guidelines for you to participate. If you don't have any rules or guidelines, especially when fighting, why would you want to participate in that? It's a free for all, right? And you do lots of damage, like bringing a chair in from the stands, like now it's the WWF.
So in that remind stage, ideally, you've already created agreements because you heard us say, hey, create agreements for times of conflict. In this fourth step, you're now reviewing them, and it would be acknowledging like, hey, all right, I know that I broke the agreement of no swearing, and I really commit to doing that, to not swearing in the future. And I know that's an agreement and I broke it and I'm going to keep it next time.
And just some other quick examples. Like for us, we have an agreement of not like turning your back and like just walking out of the room and being done. Also for us, and I don't want anyone to get stuck on this one, we have an agreement not to bring up the past, but you do have to be resolved about things you might not have repaired yet from the past to be able to have that agreement in place.
Right.
So for us, first of all, we focus on repairing everything. When we're actually repaired and complete, our agreement is we're not going to bring that up again in a fight or argument sometime later.
No, you're not reloading that as new ammunition to bring up and use against your spouse.
Well said, exactly. So then the finale here, the fifth R is to reconcile the conflict as an opportunity. Now, what do you mean conflict as an opportunity? No, I don't want conflict to happen. They shouldn't happen. No. This is all about trying to look for the positive outcome in a way. Like, what's the silver lining here? How did we grow? How did we, work through something? Did we learn something about each other or ourselves? So you can either remember the conflict as something that you wish didn't happen. It ruined a perfectly good weekend. Or you can say, you know what? We worked through something together that was powerful, or, hey, I really learned about a vulnerability that you have, or about a trigger that you have. So you're looking for that silver lining.
We have some new agreements that we never had before. And I really do honestly believe that our conflicts are going to be much more team oriented in the future because we have these new agreements that we never had.
Exactly. So that it's really just about, what is going to be the positive lesson that you can take away from it as opposed to it being something that you wish had not happened.
Exactly.
Right. There's the old saying of, sorry just doesn't cut it. And, Jocelyn, you touched on this briefly, and there's an image in your book that just jumped off the page at me that said, I'm sorry doesn't close the circle. And what you're talking about right here, and so just try and paint a picture. I mean, if you're listening to this, think about drawing a circle, but just stopping short of touching the two ends together. And, just saying sorry doesn't complete these 5 steps that you talked about. These 5 steps are an amazing plan that couples can walk through as long as they go through all 5 steps, and they can really close the circle of this conflict, of whatever conflict they're in at the time. And I loved that visual and how it just jumped off, because it's true. I mean, there are some things you can just say sorry for it and move on, but if you're in a true conflict, that's not always going to resolve the problem. You need to know that your spouse understands you and is back on your team, because
Mm.
conflict is this adversarial thing, but at the same time in marriage, we have to link arms and walk through it together. And
Mm-hmm.
so, it's a mind-bending thing to think of, that we both want to be heard, but we also both have to get to the finish line together. And so, I love this plan that the two of you have come up with. It's genius. I think it's one of those things that we all kind of know, right? But until it's down and in front of us on paper, it's hard to actually complete it all the way through. So I love that. The one last thing I just love to quickly touch on is, how do you know if you are, Aaron, you were just talking about having things being resolved from the past. You have to know that you're resolved. How do you know that you're truly resolved and you're not just treating the same symptom argument, if you will, over and over again? How do you know that you're not resolved, or how do you then get to the deeper root problem to actually resolve that? I mean, does that just mean you haven't completed the 5 steps?
Good question. And I don't think that there's even just one answer. I think that that is kind of a complex question that could have multiple answers depending on the couple we're talking to.
Sure.
But a few things come to mind. A very clear indication that you aren't repaired or resolved is it gets brought up again,
Okay.
right? Whether it's a related conversation or not.
Mhm.
Just, oh, well, you remember when last week you da da da,
Yeah.
then okay, it's kind of a cue. It's still present for you.
Okay.
Or if there's still questions in the back of your mind, or you're still kind of feel distant
Mhm.
from each other. Okay, sure, you might still feel distant for like an hour, a few hours after even a repair conversation. It doesn't mean you bounce back and you feel like rainbows and butterflies again. But if it's now a few days later and you're still feeling almost like you have to guard yourself from the other person and you still feel distant, that's also an indication that it's not repaired.
Okay.
Now, a lot of times that's coming down to either you don't really feel that the person acknowledged the impact, or that we don't talk about this often, but that they weren't truly remorseful in some way for it. Like they might be like, okay, I get you felt disrespected, but
Right.
they don't actually say, like, I get it. Like you felt, disrespected. And so, number one, that's a big reason it would still linger. And then the second big doubt that can linger for people is, like, what are they going to do to kind of not have this happen again? So an example, a couple that we're working with, and they're at a different season now than when we first started working with them, but he has not been really showing up as the best partner, and they have a newborn baby,
Mhm.
and he was out late at night and partying and said some really hurtful things to her. And for them, it's not going to be a one-time conversation to repair.
Mhm.
And I think that's something important to note, is that if there's a really kind of intense conflict and there were really hurtful things that were said, and maybe it actually has to do with more than just, oh, I was in a bad mood or I was hangry. And
Mhm.
it actually has more to do with maybe some resentment
Yeah.
that's not been repaired, or some things that have not, some needs that haven't been met for too long. It's not going to be a one time done conversation. Like in his case, where the impact is more coming from him, there's got to be a repair plan, like in a way that he's going to demonstrate that he's doing things differently.
Mhm.
And so I think that if if you're not sure that it's really resolved, or you doubt it, or you bring it up again, maybe it's like, you know what, we need to have specific ways that we're going to, like, quote unquote, kind of make it up to each other,
Right.
or repair this with each other, or show that we're doing things differently. So I know that that's kind of it's not the one, and anything you'd add to it, or.
It kind of depends on if like trust then has
Mm-hmm.
been broken, because trust isn't going to be repaired through one conversation or even doing the 5 R's one time.
Mm-hmm.
It does require a certain consistency in you keeping to what you said.
Right.
And so that's probably, one of the last things is, yeah, if when trust is really broken, trust is only repaired by you giving your word to something, even small, but keeping to it and checking in on how you're doing on that.
Yeah. That is great. I mean, I love everything you've said. I just want to encourage everyone to go check out the book. It is a fantastic book, and especially if you're really working through conflict. I mean, I feel like this is your niche, and you guys just nail this niche. And so make sure you guys, if you're listening to this podcast, go get the book. It's going to be on our website, marriagepuzzle.com/books. Go check it out, buy your copy, and dive right into this. But you guys are amazing at conflict resolution. I mean, I don't know if you feel the same way in your marriage, because sometimes we can all feel like we have our niche, but there are some times where it's like, no, I don't feel good about communication or whatever. But from my perspective, I think you guys are great at this. So I would love for you guys to tell our listeners how they can find you as well.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Great questions today. So if you're a social person, we're meet_the Freemans on Instagram. That's also our main website URL, Meet the Freemans. And then also, if you want to grab a copy of the book and then want to get some free bonuses, we actually give $200 worth of free bonuses. You can just enter your receipt number at theargumenthangover.com. We've got like a mini course in there and some helpful worksheets. And you'll see everything that we have there as well. And we just really appreciate you and respect you guys. And you guys are making such a difference with couples and doing great work in your coaching and your podcast. So we're grateful to know you guys.
Oh, thank you guys so much. And again, I really appreciate you being here to help us out with this week's episode. And to all of our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in to another one. As always, if this is your first time, check us out at Marriage Puzzle on Facebook and Instagram. Check out our website, marriagepuzzle.com, and you can schedule a free discovery call with us. And as always, we look forward to having you back next week, where together we'll work on marriage, one puzzle piece at a time. Have a good week.